Ares, the god of war, has always stood as one of the most misunderstood figures in Greek mythology, a deity who inspired both awe and unease, fascination and suspicion, never quite winning the admiration that other Olympians received. And it is within this paradox that the story of Ares becomes rich and compelling, for he was not simply the embodiment of battle but a living symbol of the raw, unrestrained forces of conflict that humans both feared and distrusted, making him a god whose presence was necessary but whose company was seldom welcomed. To understand why the Greeks both feared and distrusted Ares, one must first step into the mindset of ancient Greek culture, where war was not just an abstract concept but a real and constant presence. Where city-states clashed for land, resources, and honor, and yet the Greeks themselves distinguished between different aspects of war, revering strategy, intelligence, and discipline while looking with suspicion at the wild fury of bloodshed and chaos. This distinction is crucial, for in Ares, they saw not the wisdom of a general or the cunning of a strategist but the storm of violence itself, the uncontrollable side of war that, once unleashed, could not easily be contained, and that was why Athena, the goddess of strategic warfare, earned their respect, while Ares often earned their mistrust. In the myths that have been preserved, Ares is portrayed as a towering figure of strength. Clad in bronze armor, his presence echoing the clamor of battlefields, yet unlike Zeus, who held the authority of kingship, or Apollo, who embodied light and harmony, Ares seemed to live for the class. In Homer's Iliad, one of the oldest and most influential epics, Ares appears not as a noble protector but as a dangerous and reckless force, often mocked by other gods, even by his own parents, Zeus and Hera, who viewed him with disdain. Zeus himself once called Ares the most hateful of all gods who dwell on Olympus, accusing him of loving strife and war for its own sake, a harsh declaration that reveals much about how even the Greeks envisioned their god of war, necessary, powerful, but deeply flawed. This ambivalence reflects the Greek attitude toward war itself. War could bring glory, expand territories, and establish dominance, but it also brought destruction, suffering, and instability. For every tale of heroism sung by bards, there were countless nameless victims of battle, and Ares stood as the divine personification of that very reality. To honor him was to acknowledge the presence of violence in human affairs, yet to love him was difficult, for who could truly embrace the endless cycle of conflict without hesitation? The Greeks thus worshipped Ares with caution, offering sacrifices when war loomed near, but they never built the grand temples for him that were reserved for gods like Zeus, Athena, or Apollo. His cult was modest, his followers few, for his gift was one that humans accepted reluctantly, and his favor often came with great cost. The myths also paint Ares as a god often defeated or humiliated. And this image further explains the distrust he inspired. Unlike Athena, who symbolized victory through wisdom and discipline, Ares frequently succumbed to rash impulses, charging into battles without foresight. In the Iliad, for example, he supports the Trojans with fiery passion, yet his intervention brings more chaos than success. When Diomedes, a mortal hero blessed by Athena, confronts him, Ares is wounded and forced to retreat, crying out to Olympus, a scene that highlights his vulnerability and contrasts sharply with the composed strength of Athena. To the Greeks, such depictions underscored that Ares, for all his might, was not a reliable protector but a volatile and unstable force, one that could turn the tide of battle unpredictably. Yet Ares was not without complexity, and this is where his story deepens. For beneath the surface of fury lies the truth that war is not merely destruction but also a test of courage, a crucible through which both gods and mortals reveal their strength. Ares embodied the raw energy that drove warriors to charge into the fray. The heartbeat that quickened when swords clashed, the unyielding force that refused to surrender. Without Ares, war would lose its terror, but also its fire. And so, while the Greeks feared him, they also recognized that he represented something essential to the human condition, the capacity to confront conflict head-on, to embrace danger, to survive when all seems lost. This paradox made him a god both necessary and unwelcome, a figure whose power was undeniable but whose presence brought unease. Ares's relationships with other gods further highlight his unique place in the pantheon. His notorious love affair with Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, has been told and retold for centuries. For it symbolizes the strange union of passion and destruction, desire and danger. In their union, love itself became intertwined with war, beauty with violence, showing how irresistible yet dangerous the pull of Ares could be. The tale of their affair, exposed by Hephaestus, Aphrodite's husband, added a layer of scandal and mockery to Ares's reputation, making him appear not only reckless in battle but also foolish in love. Yet even here, one can see the deeper truth. Ares, for all his flaws, was deeply human in his impulses, driven by desire, pride, anger, and passion, making him a god who mirrored the very emotions that mortals themselves struggled with. The Greeks also told of Ares as a father to numerous children, many of whom carried on his traits of ferocity and battle lust. Some, like the Amazons, the legendary warrior women, embodied both the strength and the wild independence associated with Ares's lineage. Others, like the sons who fought against Hercules, were remembered for their hostility and eventual downfall. These stories reveal that the legacy of Ares was not one of peace and stability but of continual struggle, a lineage that mirrored the endless recurrence of war throughout human history. In considering why the Greeks distrusted Ares, one must also compare him to other war deities across cultures. In Roman mythology, for example, Mars, the counterpart of Ares, was revered as a guardian of Rome, associated not only with war but with agriculture and fertility, making him a central figure in Roman society. The Romans saw Mars as noble, disciplined, and vital to their identity, while the Greeks saw Ares as reckless and destructive. This difference speaks volumes about how each culture viewed war. For the Romans, war was tied to the destiny of empire, while for the Greeks, it was a chaotic necessity that threatened the balance of their city-states. Thus, Ares's reputation was not merely about his personality but about the cultural lens through which the Greeks interpreted conflict. The fear of Ares also stemmed from the recognition of what unrestrained violence could do to the human spirit. The Greeks were philosophers as well as warriors, a people who valued balance, moderation, and order, principles embodied in their concept of sophrosyne or self-control. Ares, in contrast, was the antithesis of self-control, the god of impulses, rage, and destruction. To embrace him fully would be to surrender to chaos, to abandon reason, to let the storm of violence consume all. And so, while they acknowledged his existence and offered him sacrifices, they held him at arm's length, wary of the destruction he represented. Still, there were moments when Ares's presence was not only feared but invoked with desperation. In times of invasion, when city walls were threatened, when lives hung in the balance, the Greeks turned to Ares, pleading for his strength to protect them. It was in these moments that the paradox of Ares became most clear. Though distrusted, he was also indispensable, for who else could grant the raw courage needed to face overwhelming odds? And thus, the god of war remained a constant presence, never fully embraced, never fully rejected, a figure both worshipped and reviled. The myths of Ares also reveal deeper lessons about human nature. In him, the Greeks projected their own struggles with the allure and terror of violence, the temptation to give in to anger, the difficulty of restraining destructive impulses. Ares was a mirror held up to humanity, showing them what they might become if they surrendered to fury without wisdom. By distrusting him, the Greeks expressed their desire to keep violence under control, to acknowledge its power but also its danger. In this way, Ares was not just a god to be feared but a teacher of caution, a reminder that the line between courage and recklessness is thin, and that unchecked power can lead to downfall. Even though Ares was often scorned, he never disappeared from Greek mythology, and this endurance speaks to his relevance. For as long as humans wage war, the figure of Ares will remain, not as a hero to be admired but as a warning to be heeded. His presence in the Iliad, in myths of the Amazons, in stories of his children and his loves, ensures that he remains a part of the grand tapestry of Greek mythology, a figure whose complexity invites reflection. He may not have temples filled with worshippers or hymns sung in his honor, but he has endured in memory because he represents something timeless, the uncontrollable storm of conflict that lies within the human heart. In reflecting on Ares, one can also see the balance that the Greeks sought in their worldview. They did not deny the existence of violence, nor did they glorify it without question. Instead, they placed Ares among the gods, giving him his place but keeping him at a distance, recognizing that to erase him would be to deny reality, but to embrace him fully would be to invite ruin. In this delicate balance, the Greeks revealed their wisdom, acknowledging that war is both a part of life and a danger to it, a force to be respected but never trusted. And so, Ares remained, feared and distrusted, a god who embodied the storm but who also reminded mortals of the need for restraint, wisdom, and balance in the face of conflict. Though the Greeks often held Ares at a distance, his presence within their myths is too significant to overlook, for he appears again and again, not as a quiet background figure but as a force that disrupts, agitates, and challenges, a reminder that war is never truly absent from human affairs. If Athena symbolized the harmony of planning and discipline, Ares symbolized the raw passion that drives humans to pick up arms even when logic warns against it, and this tension between the rational and the irrational played out in countless stories, offering audiences both in ancient times and today a way to reflect on why conflict continues to haunt humanity. Ares's personality, as described by poets, was not one of calm patience but of constant agitation, restless energy, a craving for the noise of shields and spears, and this alone made him stand apart from most Olympians who embodied more balanced or noble aspects of life. In the Iliad, one of the richest sources of Greek mythology, the disdain that Zeus and Hera express toward their son is not simply familial conflict but a symbolic rejection of his values. For even among the gods, Ares seemed to lack restraint. When Athena strikes him down with the help of Diomedes, the image is clear: reason and wisdom triumph over fury and chaos. The scene is not only dramatic but also deeply philosophical, suggesting that the Greeks believed strategy and intellect must always guide strength. Otherwise, strength becomes self-destructive. The fact that Ares is shown as wounded and retreating to Olympus, crying to Zeus, portrays him almost as a petulant child rather than a formidable warrior, which further emphasized why the Greeks distrusted him. He was powerful, yes, but unreliable, prone to impulsive decisions that could harm allies as much as enemies. Yet outside of Homer, other traditions gave Ares a more nuanced role. In some local cults, he was worshipped as a protector, especially in regions that faced constant threats of invasion. To these people, Ares was not just the bringer of chaos but also a shield against it, for in his ferocity lay the power to repel enemies. In Sparta, for example, although Athena and Artemis were more prominent, Ares was still acknowledged as a figure who embodied the Spartan ideal of relentless courage. The Spartans, who lived lives of discipline and warfare, could find resonance with the god who embraced battle fully, even if he was mocked elsewhere in Greece. This diversity of perspectives shows that Ares was not universally despised but rather differently interpreted depending on cultural needs. Ares's myths also reveal his interactions with mortals, and these encounters often underline his nature as a god who stirs violence rather than resolves it. One such story involves his trial on the hill of Areopagus in Athens, after he killed Halirrhothius, a son of Poseidon, who had assaulted Ares's daughter Alcippe. This myth presents a rare moment where Ares's violent nature seems justified, for he acted to defend his daughter's honor, yet even here the result is not a celebration but a trial, a questioning of his actions, and it is from this story that the Areopagus, the Athenian court, took its name, suggesting that even in myth, Ares's behavior required judgment and oversight. This again reflects the Greek view that unchecked violence, even when motivated by justice, must be carefully examined and restrained by law. The theme of Ares as both defender and destroyer extends into his relationships with his children. The Amazons, fierce warrior women said to be descended from him, and the nymph Harmonia, represent one of the most intriguing legacies of Ares. They carried his spirit of fearlessness, independence, and battle prowess, living apart from men and engaging in wars that often brought them into conflict with Greek heroes. The very existence of the Amazons in mythology both fascinated and unsettled the Greeks, for they symbolized a reversal of traditional roles, embodying strength and defiance that could not be ignored. Through them, Ares's influence stretched beyond battlefields into cultural imagination, challenging norms and stirring debates about gender, power, and war. Another aspect of Ares's mythological role is his entanglement with love, most notably with Aphrodite. Their affair, as scandalous as it was, also served to unite two extremes of human experience, love and war. The ancient poets did not miss the irony of this union, for in Aphrodite's embrace, Ares found passion, yet their relationship was exposed and ridiculed by Hephaestus, reminding audiences that passion without discretion leads to humiliation. Still, their union bore children such as Eros, in some versions, and Harmonia, symbolizing that even from chaos and scandal could emerge forces of attraction and concord. This interplay suggests that the Greeks saw in Ares not only danger but also the potential for transformation, for war and love are both powerful forces that can create as well as destroy. Despite his reputation, Ares's endurance in myth points to something essential. He personified the part of humanity that could not be erased. The Greeks may have distrusted him, but they could not deny him, for war was a reality they constantly faced. In fact, by keeping Ares in their stories, they acknowledged that conflict, however undesirable, was intrinsic to the human condition. Unlike gods of agriculture, music, or wisdom, whose domains could be pursued with joy, Ares's domain was one that people endured rather than sought. Yet the very act of telling stories about him, of weaving him into epics and dramas, kept alive the reminder that violence lurks always on the edges of civilization. Ready to break through when order falters, the Roman transformation of Ares into Mars provides a striking contrast. Mars became one of the most honored gods of Rome, associated not only with war but with the founding of the city itself, as the father of Romulus and Remus. For the Romans, Mars was a symbol of duty, discipline, and the destiny of empire. Where Ares was distrusted, Mars was celebrated. This difference underscores the cultural divide. The Greeks valued the harmony of the polis, the balance of reason, and the containment of chaos, whereas the Romans saw war as the pathway to glory and permanence. Thus, the same deity, viewed through different lenses, could embody either suspicion or reverence. Showing how mythology reflects not only divine archetypes but cultural ideals, as centuries passed, Ares continued to serve as a symbol in art and literature. In vase paintings, he is often depicted as a fully armed warrior, helmet shining, spear in hand, his stance ready for battle. Yet rarely does he stand alone in triumph. Instead, he appears as part of larger scenes, often overshadowed by other figures like Athena or Apollo, reinforcing his role as a disruptive presence rather than a central hero. The Greeks may not have composed hymns to Ares as they did to other gods, but by including him in their art, they ensured that his image remained etched in cultural memory. The philosophical dimension of Ares is perhaps his most lasting contribution. By embodying the unrestrained side of human aggression, Ares became a warning, a reminder of what happens when passion overrides reason. In modern terms, one might say that Ares personifies the dangers of acting without reflection, of letting anger dictate choices, of pursuing conflict for its own sake. The Greeks, with their emphasis on balance, moderation, and wisdom, placed him among the gods not to glorify him but to acknowledge his reality. To say, this force exists, it is powerful, but it must be watched, distrusted, and kept in check. Even today, the figure of Ares continues to resonate. In literature, film, and popular culture, he often appears as the antagonist, the embodiment of destructive war, opposed by heroes who value peace, justice, or wisdom. Yet in this role, he serves an important function, for without conflict there is no story, without challenge there is no heroism, and Ares, in embodying the ultimate challenge of unchecked violence, provides the backdrop against which courage, intelligence, and compassion can shine. The Greeks both feared and distrusted Ares because he was too much like themselves in their darkest moments. Unlike Athena, who elevated war into an art of strategy, Ares reflected the raw impulses that surge in every human heart, the rage that flares when insulted, the pride that refuses to back down, the aggression that rises in times of threat. To face Ares was to face that part of oneself, and perhaps this is why the Greeks never gave him the love they gave other gods. They could admire Athena because she represented their highest aspirations, but they could not embrace Ares because he represented their most dangerous instincts. Still, in recognizing him, they showed a wisdom that remains relevant, that to live fully, one must acknowledge not only the light but also the shadow. Thus, the legacy of Ares is not one of worship or admiration but of caution and reflection. His myths remind us that war, while sometimes unavoidable, must never be glorified blindly. His defeats at the hands of mortals, his humiliations at the hands of other gods, his troubled relationships, all serve as allegories for the consequences of recklessness and excess. And yet, his persistence in myth shows that he could not simply be erased, for to erase Ares would be to deny the reality of conflict, and the Greeks, with their clear-eyed realism, chose instead to include him, to distrust him, but to acknowledge him nonetheless. When we consider Ares today, we see more than just a god of war. We see a symbol of the human struggle with violence, a reminder that within us lies both the capacity for great wisdom and the temptation to give in to rage. The Greeks feared and distrusted Ares not because he was irrelevant but because he was all too real. A mirror of the forces that can tear apart societies and souls if left unchecked. In this way, Ares continues to teach, not through admiration but through warning, not through glory but through caution. His story is the story of conflict itself, a story that has not ended, a story that humanity must continue to reckon with. And perhaps that is why he remains unforgettable, feared yet necessary, distrusted yet enduring, the god of war whose lesson is as vital now as it was in ancient Greece.